Workers' Party union, and also bringing in the social side of it. So how would that come together? Who would make up the kind of rules or where you're heading, the direction you want to take? How would that go about to form that relationship between the social part of it and the worker part?
Did you hear her question, Nick?
No, I couldn't. If you could repeat it, unfortunately.
Essentially, you spoke of an independent party for a workers' party, and Priscilla is curious as to how that would integrate with the social movement, if I'm understanding you correctly.
Yes. Okay, thanks for the question. The objective that we've committed ourselves to as the Movement for a People's Party, and also as part of the Coalition for a Labor Community, an independent party, is to build a coalition of many different organizations. So the perspective that we need a major new party, it really is everywhere. It is throughout, of course, it is throughout unions, throughout working people, throughout progressive organizations. And so I believe that our first task is to consolidate those who share that view into a force by building a coalition among unions, among progressive organizations, into, and I think that the Labor Community Campaign for an Independent Party is that vehicle that we can do that with. But I believe that the first thing that we have to do, which is showing great promise, of course, in other countries, new progressive parties and socialist parties are toppling and pushing aside the old neoliberal parties that have been in power for decades, whether it's in Spain, it's in Greece, it's in Chile, whether it's in France, whether it's in Mexico most recently with López Obrador. Each of these has, of course, their the things that really set them back. But still, the fact that that is happening shows that there is this great global revolution against neoliberalism. And the approach that exists in other countries, which is of course easier there because there are more parliamentary systems, is that of coalition building. But the mandate to build a coalition and to bring together those in the United States who have that view is still first and foremost.
I had a question.
Yes, sir.
I want to know what does this mean, in fact, for African Americans or indigency? I've been around for quite some time. We went through a number of different iterations around policy, language, so forth, and women and queer and trans. Oftentimes they're continually being marginalized, and there's a technocratic position of those who are highly skilled coming out of the universities who tend to dominate this, although it may not be intentional. These particular processes and certain voices are marginalized. Then when we have a movement, when we talk about labor, it tends to be very homogeneous, cis-sexist, or misogynistic. I like to hear from Margaret and yourself. And then when you talk about Spain, and you talk about these other countries, there's a different culture, different dynamic, and a different history. And it gets confused with someone under $10,000 or $15,000 a year who doesn't have a master's degree or is that highly technical skill. So how do you relate this to those who are under $15,000, queers, trans, black women, and so forth?
Well, it's a good question, you know, because progressives have often been guilty of being elitist, sometimes even racist in their political formation. So I think it's a good idea to recognize that that is a risk, even as we begin these new movements and we begin to strengthen new parties or start new parties. I think it's important for, part of the problem though is that black people are trapped in the Democratic Party, where our goal is to try to keep the Republicans out of office, excuse me, and And that creates this cognitive dissonance where we ignore things that are against our interest in, to see them as this lesser evil. And I think, though, that unfortunately that might mean that black people are the last ones to leave the Democratic Party, and that would be a shame. I would hope that we would be the ones to lead, that we would take the lead in these new movements, because we've always been the ones to lead. Every time there's some great advance for people in this country, it's been because we were in the forefront. So I think the one way we avoid that is that we are the leadership and we make it clear. And then we have to be careful that we do not fall into those traps of elitism. I know there's a new Poor People's Campaign, and I hope there are some poor people in the leadership of it. So I think that is that should be our goal.
Well, the shelters were not there. I was there in D.C., and many of the shelters around the United States were not there.
Yes, well, that's unfortunate. That's something that we have to change. But I think in general, if the marginalized groups that you mentioned are the ones who are in the forefront, the ones who are in the vanguard, then I think that will help.
And what's the process for implementing this vanguard position?
Well, that's more detail, frankly, than I have. But all I can do now is keep it more general. But those are good questions as we move forward.
How do you feel about, as a white male, college educated, who's well versed on these issues? How do we make it more diverse, eclectic, and what have you? Because having a high skill set is a power base.
That's true.
Your question is for Nick?
Yes.
Nick, the gentleman would like to hear your thoughts on more inclusiveness and democracy and intersectionality, particularly with including communities of color and other minorities in the movement.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, like Margaret pointed out, it is communities of color who have been at the forefront, in particular African Americans who've been at the forefront of social change in the United States. And so I believe that they need to be at the table, people of color, whether it is queer, trans, need to be with us as we form this movement from the beginning. Absolutely. I'm glad that for the Labor Community Campaign for an Independent Party, that we have the Ujima People's Party, a black founded party in Baltimore that has signed on as well, and that we have founder Nnamdi Lumumba who is with us. I believe that is those are the kinds of discussions that we need to have, like we're having with him, over how to make this inclusive from the beginning, and with Margaret Kimberley as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question, please. Yes, ma'am.
2 questions. One, what about the Green Party? Have they signed on? If not, why not? Why haven't the Green Party been a base for what you're doing? You could comment on that. And secondly, from the peace movement's perspective locally, the unions have not been supporters of a peace economy or reducing the military. Just because it's labor doesn't mean that it is necessarily radical and progressive. So there is certainly a base in the labor arena that is not supportive of where we want to go.
Nick, her question was 2-part. Firstly, what is the involvement of the Green Party with the Movement for People's Party? Why are they not the base for moving forward? And secondly, why does organized labor not take a stronger stance in the peace movement?
Well, we know it's economic. They're afraid of losing their jobs. But what I'm saying is that they're not necessarily progressive in the way we need them to be.
Perhaps labor unions are not as progressive in the way that we need them to be.
I believe that applies to the leadership of many of the labor unions, unfortunately. I think there is a trend of corporate unionism that we saw very much throughout 2016 in those unions that jumped to endorse Hillary Clinton. And so this is not about bringing the labor unions into another corporate party. Obviously, this objective is to move unions and to move them into a vehicle that represents workers much more. Workers wanted the progressive policies that the Sanders campaign was advocating for. And at the Labor Notes conference this year, I heard it very much. I heard great applause and celebration whenever anyone would bring up the idea of breaking with corporate parties. And in terms of the Green Party, I think that what will be the case is that in the example of the Republican Party replacing the Whig Party as an abolitionist party, there were other abolitionist parties that existed before the Republican Party, and that was the Free Soil Party, the Liberty Party, but it was a new party that formed at the right juncture that managed to pull out institutional resources from the establishment parties, from the Democratic Party, I mean from the Whig Party at the time. That was what actually succeeded in replacing a major establishment party. And I think that is how history will play out once again. And I believe that our approach, which is more coalition building, more oriented towards coalition building, that is what we think needs to happen. We need to build this broad base and then see what form that takes. But it's very imperative that we come together as a coalition now of those who believe that we need an independent party.
Thank you. Next question. Yes?
Yeah, I'm Al Hart, and I'm been a member of UE for many years. UE was one of the unions that endorsed the Labor Party in the 1990s. Was very active in it. We recruited our members to join the Labor Party. We recruited our locals to endorse the Labor Party. After a few years, our members became very disenchanted with the Labor Party, which sounds very much like what you're proposing now, because the Labor Party never ran a single candidate for any office anywhere on earth. And working people understand a political party means you run for office and you win. And the Labor Party never even tried. So you endorsed Ralph Nader in 2000, in part to light a fire under the ass of the Labor Party to start running candidates. It didn't work. I mean, I make no apologies for that. As far as being afraid of being called a spoiler, we don't worry about that at all. But for 17 years, I've happily argued with any liberal that wants to blame us for the victory of George Bush because of this bullshit. It's the Democrats that have only themselves to blame. Well, what I'm worried about is not being a spoiler, but continuing to be a beautiful loser. I've been on the left for 50 years. I've watched leftist candidates over and over celebrate that they got 3% of the vote and be overjoyed because they got 5% of the vote. I don't think that accomplishes anything, and that's why I'm not agreeing. A year and a half ago, I joined. I'm certainly not a herring tonight, but a year and a half ago, I joined the Pittsburgh chapter of DSA, which has grown in 2 years from 0 to 800 members. We've elected in less than a year. We've elected 4 people to public office. I'm now represented by a district justice who's elected by DSA, who is stopping sending people to jail because they can't make bail, and stopping foreclosures. I'm now going to be represented in January by a socialist woman in the state legislature, along with 3 other socialist women, 2 from Philadelphia, 2 that we've elected from Pittsburgh. In districts that are predominantly white, we elected an African-American woman, the first African-American woman from Western Pennsylvania that will be in the state legislature. And in DSA, we don't endorse, in our chapter anyway, we don't endorse anybody who doesn't call themselves a socialist. We're not endorsing Governor Tom Wolf for any half-assed liberals. We're endorsing socialists and we're electing socialists. And we've made ourselves feared by the Democratic leadership. The Democratic establishment in Pittsburgh is scared of Pittsburgh DSA. And I got to tell you, somebody who's been on the left for a long time, I've known this feeling in the labor movement when we could make our employers afraid of us. But having your enemies fear you is a nice feeling. And I think we should find some ways to do that. I don't want to take over the Democratic Party. I despise the Democratic Party. But maybe we should look at the model of what the British labor movement did 120 years ago. They had an organization called the Labor Representation Committee. They elected people to Parliament using the Liberal Party as a vehicle. They worked with the Liberals. When they got to a critical mass where they felt they had enough seats in Parliament, they said, we've got some news for you, Liberal Party. We're not the LRC anymore. We're the Labor Party. And within a few years, the Liberal Party was the third party, and Labor was the second party. I think we need to try some different things, but I am not happy with voting for people who really are kind of running to lose, because I've seen it for too long. We need to do something different. Humanity doesn't have time for us to wait and wait and wait until a third party somehow catches fire.
I just want to add to that question. The problem with the labor movement is wedded to the Democratic Party. And they are, well, that's, thank God, that there's at least one that is not, but I was referring to this person's question here about not counting on labor unions to really be left. That's because they back the Democrats. They are in the same, labor unions are in the same position where that black people are in and others are in being trapped or feeling themselves to be trapped. I say get out of the trap.
Yes, sir?
Sort of like the second that motion. In the late 60s and early 70s, we had a party in Ann Arbor called the Human Rights Party. We elected the first openly gay and openly lesbian local candidates, and I'm actually thinking that sort of good local third-party formations of various kinds are very viable. But Michael Harrington, and I've been a DSA member for many years as well, he used to point out something that I think is correct. And that is that while at the national level, the two parties are not different at all. At the state level, the class struggle is manifested in a very real way in the policy positions of the Republican and Democratic parties. And to deny that, and to deny the significance of the very real differences between those political positions at the state level is to essentially, and I'm just reading I used to be the independent press movement in the late 60s and early 70s, and I'm so happy to see that the Free Press is publishing again with Bob Patrikas and Harvey Wasserman, and they have interviews in here with some very fine people from the Green Party. I know many people who went into the Green Party and were running around Detroit in the last presidential election with their Green Party tickets, T-shirts, and infiltrating the Democratic National Convention, even though they were Greens, to create disruption within that. And I don't buy the idea that the Green Party and the energy that went into that didn't influence the Michigan and Pennsylvania electoral outcome. I think on the other hand, I sort of feel, and I'm glad to see that the gentleman making yet another effort to start a third-party formation, that there's many of us, including people I learned politics from, who were the Progressive Party in the late 40s, early 50s. Many of us have concluded that this is not going to work to try to step another third-party effort. I think what DSA is doing is great, but only one thing about that. If there's a third party in this country in the next few years, it's not going to come from the left. It's going to come from the center. And it's going to tap on some very powerful political forces in this country who favor pragmatism, which is an indigenous American philosophy. I'm a progressive pragmatist. If I run, I'm in trouble because I won't get supported. I'm a progressive pragmatist. I believe we need to look at the proper mix of the public, nonprofit, and market sector in order to meet human needs consistently with human rights. And that's not necessarily strictly a socialist position, because there's a lot of pragmatists in the center and on the left. And I believe that there's going to be some kind of new party formation. It's going to be a very difficult position for the left to decide. I think we probably will want to support that kind of effort to do away with with both parties and form a new pragmatic, formation in this country that's focused on human needs, not ideology, that's for human needs, not corporate greed, and is willing to, we had Congressman Conniff speaking at the City Club this week with his new jobs bill. He wants to involve the private, public, and nonprofit sectors in developing a jobs guarantee. I support that bill. I just got back from New York at a conference that was talking about a national jobs guarantee legislation. I support this legislation. I think we need to pass a constitutional amendment for the right to a job living wage, ERA, and I think we need to focus on policies, pragmatic, doable policies, and not get caught up in the party vehicle. If we have the right strategy, we'll win at the ballot box one way or another. I mean, that's how I do it. Because I walk by, I'm going to end in just 1 second, but I walk by the library sign here the other day. It says here, what do you want to see before you die? I want to see some real rights established in the Constitution, and I want to see a real turnaround in the direction of this country and how we interact with the rest of the world.
Margaret, could you speak to pragmatism and real policies at the local level? You are an avowed anti two-party duopoly and have vowed not to vote for any Republican or Democrat, especially at the national level. Do you see any difference at the local or state level when it comes down to policy level?
I think the local level can be more important than people think. There are people who go every 4 years to vote for president and never are involved in anything, actually things that may have more of an impact on their lives at the local level. But in general, as far as what does pragmatic mean? Is something considered pragmatic only if it's happened before, or things that are seem to be impossible considered not pragmatic? So that's a tricky word. It can too often end up being the status quo, that things don't change, that we're always told, well, this isn't going to happen, well, forget that, well, that's not going to happen. So I'm pretty careful with that word pragmatic. The things I want are things that are not deemed to be pragmatic by conventional wisdom. But that's been true of many things, many changes that have taken place in this country. So it's not a word that I'm prone to use.
I heard the question as well. Can I answer?
Sure. Real quick.
Yes, go ahead.
I support a mass centrist party that was trying to overthrow. That was that's a party we could influence, because it's not dyed in the wool in terms of what solutions it needs. The right to a job may be something they go for.
Right, well, I don't know, a right to a job is not considered centrist anymore. It should be.
Okay, Nick, very briefly, the questioner would like to know if you would support a centrist third party.
I don't believe that working people support a centrist political party. It depends on how you define it. If you define centrism as between the Democrats and Republicans, absolutely not. That's just between the right and the left wing of the billionaire spectrum. But I want to really echo what Margaret said. That is, the Magna Carta was impossible and outside the realm of political possibility. So was abolishing slavery. So was women's suffrage. So confining ourselves to that is a recipe for remaining within the confines of what we have suffered for decades and for many years. So there are differences between the two parties, but it's not enough to to keep your job in the country. It's not enough to get restorative justice. It's not enough to address climate change. It's not enough to get money out of politics. So that's my perspective there. Then there's also the issue that every institutional mechanism inside the Democratic Party is actually built to real progressives or socialists who are elected to the Democratic Party into the party establishment to soften their message and co-opt them truly. And we've seen that, of course, for many, many years as well. That is why, despite progressives elected to the Democratic Party for decades through the Rainbow Coalition, far before that, the character of the party and the direction of the country has not changed. And so, and to answer the point about DSA, DSA's ultimate goal is to create an independent party. But DSA will take pressure upon DSA and other organizations to hold them to that goal. And I believe that's part of the role that we play, and part of making sure that this does go in that direction, because the temptation to remain inside the Democratic Party and get comfortable there is very great, as history has shown.
Is there another question here in the middle? Yes, Tony?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, very quick question. What is preventing Green Party, Movement for a People's Party, and DSA from merging? Because if you look at the platforms, they're very much alike. So where are the areas of disagreement? And what would prevent a new formation of those three elements?
Nick,
Well,
did you hear his
quickly-
question?
I did hear the question. Different strategies, I think, are part is that DSA has a different approach. It believes that working inside the Democratic Party is viable. We have a different approach. We believe that we need an independent formation and that we won't get real lasting change. You look at the changes that were made even in the New Deal era, and they've all been revoked. They've all been taken away. So even the struggles that millions of people struggled for those New Deal achievements, the social safety net and the financial regulations and the new labor laws, and all of those have been undone. That is what you face with the Democratic and the Republican Party. So I think the difference is one of approach.
Well, that's a good question. I think it's something that can be discussed. The problem with coalitions is, people feel very strongly. That's why they have different identities. And where would people give? Where would people take? Where would there be compromise? What would be the ultimate goal? Those are all serious questions. But I think it's something. I think it's worth considering. It's worth discussing.
One other quick question. What about independent candidates?
What about independent candidates? Independent of a party. Do you have anything to say on that, Nick?
Yes, actually, with the Labor Community Campaign for an Independent Party, I believe Todd is there, and he has the actual statement that we're coming together around. There he is. And the goal is to use independent candidates, municipal independent candidates selected from municipal labor communities, assemblies, in order to build up a greater bench and initial presence. So that, because the idea of running headlong into campaigns for governor, Senate, without any kind of social basis, without any kind of support within the community, without having, without any resources, is not a winning strategy. So independent candidates are a big way to build a base, create a foundation for a new party.
Thanks, Nick. Mike, did you have a question in the back?
Yeah, I just wanted to repeat something that I'm sure Margaret might have said, and I've heard it from other people. I myself have voted and worked for the Democratic Party since 1996. And I always thought, well, this will be great. We'll get a Democrat in. They made these promises, and I was hoping that they would keep their promises. The biggest promise that I always believed in, because of my health condition, I'm a type 1 diabetic. I've lived with this for 56 years. Is not just for me, but for everyone, is improved Medicare for all. Now, Obama had the chance, he had a majority, he had a chance to have single payer, is what they were calling it back then, and they gave in to the big corporate insurance companies. Even Max Baucus, who's a Democrat, got bought out, lobbied, whatever, in the pockets of the insurance companies. So why do I want to keep voting Democratic? And Margaret has said it, I'm saying it. If you keep doing the same thing over and over again, what is that a definition of? And it's not working.
Agreed.
Thank you, everybody, for coming today.